There is a room full of 200 people, and every single one of them goes quiet at the same moment. Not the quiet of reverence, not the quiet of a prayer being offered or a vow being spoken. The quiet of something unexpected entering a space that had been arranged, down to the last white ribbon and the last silver fork, to prevent exactly this kind of interruption. A man is standing. He was seated a moment ago beside the woman who is going to be his wife in 40 minutes, and now he is on his feet, and the expression on his face is not anger, not grief, not the look of a man who has lost his temper. It is something quieter and more final than any of those things. It is the look of a man who has made a decision he should have made a long time ago and has simply run out of time to keep postponing it. Everyone in that room is watching him. No one is watching the kitchen door. No one ever watches the kitchen door. 6 weeks earlier, on a Tuesday in late April, a letter arrived at the Hatch property outside Harlow Creek, Wyoming, and Nora Hatch almost burned it without reading past the first line. She had been up since before 4. The roof above the back bedroom had been leaking since February, a slow and patient drip falling into the same tin bucket she had emptied every morning for 3 months, and she had spent the dark hours before dawn doing what she always did with problems she could not yet solve, which was to calculate them. She lay in the dark and counted. The remaining balance on the banknote was $40. The garden would not produce enough to sell before August. The 3 cattle she had left were not enough to matter. $40. That was the number the morning kept returning to. The way a river returns to a stone it has been working on for years. She read the letter standing at the kitchen table, still in her work clothes, a cup of cold coffee at her elbow. The paper was good quality, heavier than anything that came to the Hatch farm. The handwriting at the top was a man's hand, plain and direct, but the paragraph in the middle, the one that set the conditions of employment, had been written in a different hand entirely. Smaller, more controlled, the kind of handwriting that had been practiced until it no longer revealed anything. The letter was from Copper Ridge, the Merritt property north of town. Gideon Merritt, it said, was to be married on the 4th of July. The wedding would host 200 guests. The family required an experienced cook of the highest caliber for full preparation and service of the wedding feast. 6 weeks of preparation beginning the 1st of May, 2 days of full service. The compensation offered was $40, and then the paragraph in the smaller, more careful hand. The person engaged for cooking services will not present herself before guests at any time during the celebration. She will not enter any room where guests are present. She will not make herself visible in any way that draws attention to her position or her person. She will conduct all work from the kitchen only and will remain there for the duration of the event. Nora set the letter down. She picked it up again. She read that paragraph twice more, not because she had failed to understand it the first time, but because she wanted to be certain she understood exactly what it was asking her to be. Invisible. Not just quiet, not just professional, not just discreet in the way that any hired person is expected to be discreet. Invisible. As though the food would appear on the tables of its own accord. As though the 4-tiered wedding cake would assemble itself from flour and butter and intention without any human hands being involved in the process. She understood the paragraph immediately and completely because she had been receiving some version of it since she was 12 years old. She was 38. She was 5 feet and 9 inches tall. She carried herself at around 240 pounds on a frame built by 38 years of physical work, of hauling water and lifting hay bales and working kitchen gardens in the hard Wyoming soil. She wore cotton work dresses that fit her, and boots that had been resoled twice, and a wide-brimmed hat that had started its life a pale tan color and was now something closer to the color of the earth it spent its days near. She had not been considered beautiful by anyone in Harlow Creek since before her husband Samuel died, and she had not been considered much of anything else either, which in her experience was often how it went. $40 was the exact remaining balance on the banknote. $40 was the difference between keeping the 40 acres Samuel had left her and walking away from the only ground she had ever been able to call her own. There was no version of this letter she could afford to refuse. She wrote back that same evening. 2 sentences. She accepted. She would arrive at the 1st of May with everything she required. What she did not write, and what she did not tell anyone in town, was why she was really going. It was not the money, though she needed it the way a person standing in a burning building needs a door. It was something else, something she had carried for 6 years since Samuel died and left her the farm and the debt and the very specific kind of silence that comes when the person who witnessed your life is no longer there to witness it. She was the best cook in Harlow Creek County, had been since she was 19 years old, and her grandmother handed her the cast iron skillet and said, "Now you know enough to do this without me." But no one in the county had ever fed 200 people at once. No one had ever had occasion to. The kitchen at Copper Ridge, from what she had heard, was built for exactly this kind of work. 2 wood-burning stoves, a wide stone hearth, a cold cellar below the floorboards. A serious kitchen, built by someone who understood that feeding people was serious work. She had been handed an arrangement designed to make her invisible. She intended to make the finest meal anyone in Wyoming Territory had eaten in 20 years. Those 2 things, she had decided, were not incompatible. She could be invisible and extraordinary at the same time. She had been doing exactly that for most of her life. She arrived at Copper Ridge on the first Monday of May, with her knives wrapped in cloth and her grandmother's cast iron skillet packed in straw, and a list of every dish she intended to prepare, already committed entirely to memory. She had spent the night before at her kitchen table going over quantities and timing and sourcing until the numbers sat clean and certain in her mind. That was how Nora Hatch handled fear. She turned it into a problem she could solve, and then she solved it. The ranch kitchen was everything she had been told it would be. The 2 stoves were cast iron, well-maintained, with good draw on the flue. The hearth was wide enough to hang 4 pots at once. The cellar below the floorboards smelled of good earth and old brine, and when she stood alone in that kitchen on the first morning, she felt something loosen in her chest that had been pulled tight for longer than she could accurately measure. She felt like herself. She was still standing there, just breathing it in, when the far door opened. Sylvia Crandall was exactly what the women of Harlow Creek said she was. Though Nora had not asked and had not been looking for confirmation of anyone else's assessment, she was young. 26 at the outside, and she was tall in the way that women from money are sometimes tall, as though the world had arranged itself to give her room. She moved through the kitchen doorway without touching the frame, which Nora noticed, because Nora herself had been navigating door frames with care since she was 14. The traveling suit Sylvia wore had not come from any shop in Wyoming. Her hair was arranged in a way that must have taken her maid the better part of an hour. Her eyes, when they moved to Nora, were cool and assessing and took their time about what they found. "You are the cook," Sylvia said finally. It was not a question. "Yes." Nora kept her hands at her sides. "Nora Hatch. I received the family's letter. I know who sent the letter," Sylvia said. She moved along the edge of the work table, one gloved finger trailing the surface without quite touching it. "I have been told you are adequate. I will do my best to be better than adequate." Sylvia stopped. She turned. There was a quality to her stillness that reminded Nora of a woman who had learned, at some point and at some cost, to make her face do exactly what she wanted it to do and nothing else. "I have one condition," Sylvia said. "My mother mentioned it in the letter, but I prefer to say certain things directly." Her eyes moved, briefly and deliberately, down the length of Nora's body, the full consideration of it, the inventory. Nora had been on the receiving end of that particular look so many times in her life that she could catalog its variations the way a geologist catalogs rock formations. This version was not theatrical cruelty. It was simply matter of fact. The way a person looks at a piece of furniture, they are deciding whether to move or leave where it is. "You are not to be seen," Sylvia said. "Not by guests, not during service, not at any point during the celebration. You will remain in this kitchen. You will not enter any room where guests are present. You will not make yourself visible in any way that calls attention to your presence here." She paused for exactly 2 seconds, which was long enough to make her point and short enough to maintain the appearance of not having intended to make it. "I understand," Nora said. Her voice came out level. She was grateful for that. "Good." Sylvia moved toward the door. 4-tiered cake, something the guests from Cheyenne will not have seen before. Every dish should reflect that standard. She left without waiting for a reply. Nora stood in the empty kitchen and breathed slowly through her nose. Then she tied her apron and opened the list she kept in her head and began. The first 2 weeks ran hard and long and almost entirely in silence. Nora woke before 4 every morning, worked until the light was gone, and spent the hours between building the architecture of the feast from the ground up the way her grandmother had taught her. which was to say, from the simplest component to the most complex, from the stock to the sauce, from the lard rendered in the early morning to the sugar flowers pressed by hand in the late evening. She cured the hams herself. She put up stock. She tested her biscuit recipe 5 times before she was satisfied with the rise. She planned the wedding cake down to the individual petals of every climbing rose and sweet pea she intended to press from sugar paste, each one made with the focused attention that her grandmother had called intention, which she said was the only ingredient you could not substitute. Nobody came to the kitchen except to deliver supplies. Nobody spoke to her except to hand her an invoice or confirm a delivery time. That was fine. That was the arrangement, and she had worked alone before and she would again. The work itself was enough. She had always told herself the work was enough. On a Thursday morning in the second week, just past 5 in the morning, the back door opened. He was tall, not dramatically so, but with the ease of a man who had always been tall and stopped noticing it years ago. His work clothes already carried the day's first dust at the knees. His boots were worn at the heel in the way that boots get worn by real use rather than appearance. He had dark hair touched at the temples with early silver, and the kind of face that might have been handsome once and had, somewhere past 35, settled into something steadier and more useful than handsome. He stopped when he saw her, the way people stop when they enter a room expecting to find it empty. "Morning," he said. "Morning." Nora kept her hands in the dough just after coffee. He moved to the stove, lifted the pot, poured a cup with the ease of a man in his own kitchen, which she reminded herself he was. He sat at the far end of the table and wrapped both hands around the cup. Gideon Merritt. He looked at her directly, without performance. "I won't be in your way. I take my coffee in here most mornings. Quietest room in the house before the day starts. It's your kitchen, Mr. Merritt. You don't need my permission, maybe not, but you're running it." He looked at his cup. Seemed worth acknowledging. Nora looked at him for just a moment, then she went back to her dough. He drank his coffee without asking her anything more. He did not watch her work in the cataloging way, the measuring way, the way she was accustomed to being watched. He simply sat in the early quiet and occasionally looked out the window at the property coming awake in the morning light. And his presence in the kitchen had the particular quality of company rather than intrusion. And Nora could not fully account for the difference, but she felt it. He left after 20 minutes. "Much obliged for the quiet," he said, and walked back out the door. He was back the next morning, and the one after that. By the end of the 3rd week, it had become something neither of them had named but both of them expected. He arrived just past 5, poured his coffee, sat at the far end of the table. Nora worked. Occasionally, one of them said something. "Why the vinegar in the crust?" she said one morning, not waiting to be asked. "Keeps the gluten from tightening up, makes it flake instead of chew." He considered that with the focused attention of someone who had asked a real question and was receiving a real answer. You can taste the difference. You can feel it before you taste it, the way it gives when you press it with a fork. He nodded slowly, as though filing that away somewhere it would be useful. "Another morning. How do you know when bread is done without cutting into it? Sound." She turned a loaf over and knocked the bottom. Hollow knock means done. Dense thud. Give it 10 more minutes. Your mother teach you that, my mother and the woman who taught her. She set the loaf down. My grandmother came west from Kentucky in a covered wagon, cooked every meal on the trail. She said the most important thing about feeding people was not the recipe. What was it? Intention. Nora set down the rolling pin. Whether you thought about the people eating it while you were making it. She said you could taste the difference between food made in a hurry and food made with care. He was quiet for a moment. My mother used to say something like that. He turned his cup in a slow circle on the table. That a meal could tell you everything about who made it, if you were listening right. A pause. "She has been gone 12 years. I'm sorry," Nora said. "She would have liked you." He said it plainly, without decoration, the way a person states a thing they are simply certain of, and stood and put on his hat. "Good morning, Miss Hatch." He left. Nora stood with her hands still in the flour and looked at the closed door for a long time. She had been working in other people's kitchens for most of her adult life. She had fed ranch hands and neighbors and families of people who hired her, and never once had the thought that she would do this forever been a frightening one, because the work was real and the work was hers. But she had also spent 6 years since Samuel died understanding something she had not had language for until recently, which was the difference between being present in a room and being witnessed in it. Samuel had been a good man. He had been kind and steady and faithful to her for 11 years of marriage, and he had eaten every meal she set before him and said it was good and meant it. And not once in 11 years had he asked her why. The word, why. That was what Gideon Merritt had been offering every morning at the far end of the table. She told herself it meant nothing beyond that. He was a rancher with a woman from Cheyenne and a wedding 6 weeks away. She was a widow with a leaking roof and flour under her fingernails. The distance between those two lives was not the kind of distance that a few honest conversations over morning coffee could close. She knew that. She told herself that clearly and carefully. Then she went back to work. The third week brought Harriet Crandall. Sylvia's mother arrived on a Tuesday with a woman from Cheyenne whose purpose in the visit was never explained, but whose presence seemed to function as a form of amplification, the way a second voice amplifies the first. Harriet was thin in a way that suggested discipline rather than deprivation, and she walked through the kitchen the way a building inspector walks through a property, not looking for what was there but for what might be cited. She stopped in front of Nora's work table, where the preliminary sketches for the wedding cake had been laid out for review. Her eyes moved over them with the expression of someone who has already formed a judgment and is only consulting the evidence as a formality. "This isn't the design that was approved," she said. "I adapted it for structural stability." Nora kept her voice even. "The original wouldn't hold in July heat. What I've built will." Harriet said to the woman from Cheyenne, "You see what I mean?" Nora looked at her steadily. "With respect, Mrs. Crandall, what I built is your daughter's concept made workable. The spun sugar columns in the original specification collapse above a certain temperature. We will be serving outdoors during part of the reception. I adapted the design to prevent your daughter's wedding cake from collapsing in front of 200 guests. That is exactly what you are paying me to do." The silence that followed was the kind that has weight to it. And then, from the doorway behind Harriet, Sylvia's voice. "She is right about the heat. Let it go. Mother." Both Harriet and Nora turned. Sylvia was standing just inside the frame of the kitchen door with an expression Nora had not seen on her face before, one that had none of the performance of the one she wore in public spaces and some quality underneath it that was harder to name. She looked at the cake sketches on the table for a moment, and then she looked at Nora, and what moved through her eyes was brief and unreadable and gone before Nora could identify it. "Just make sure it's impressive," Sylvia said, and walked out. Harriet followed with one final assessment of the room. Nora picked up her spatula, waited until the footsteps faded, exhaled, and went back to work. That same evening, Opal Drummond came to the kitchen. Opal had been the house manager at the property for 15 years. She was a compact woman in her late 50s with the particular manner of someone who had spent a long time managing other people's households and had learned, at some cost, when to speak and when to wait. She sat down at the table without asking and accepted the coffee Nora poured without comment and said, "They want the Eastern grazing acres." Nora looked at her. "The senator's men. They have been after that land for 2 years. The railroad wants to run a line through the territory, and those acres are the only direct path that doesn't go through contested ground." She wrapped both hands around her cup. "That is Gideon's best grazing land. The grass comes up thicker there, holds water longer into the summer." Nora was quiet for a moment. "And the wedding," she said. Opal looked at her with 15 years of reading a house in her eyes. "I don't know what the wedding is. I know what I have seen on this property. I know Gideon Merritt is not a man who sells what his father built. And I know those men did not come here to congratulate him on his engagement." She left an hour later. Nora stood alone in the kitchen in the late evening and let that settle into her, the way cold settles into a room after the fire has gone down. She thought about Gideon, about the way he had mentioned the Eastern acres once and only once, quickly and in passing, the way people mention things they consider too self-evident to require explanation. She thought about what it meant to build something with your hands and then be asked to sign it away and call it a gift. She thought about her own 40 acres outside town, and a banknote and a tin bucket she had been emptying since February. She understood exactly what was at stake at Copper Ridge. She understood it the way she understood her own kitchen, which was to say, completely, without having to think about it. 3 days before the 4th of July, Nora went down to the cellar after the house had gone quiet to check on the hams she had been curing. She left the door open 2 inches against the July heat, and through that gap and through the thin wall of the north corridor, she heard voices from the direction of the study. She was not trying to listen. She was moving through the cellar in the dark the way she moved through any familiar space, by memory and by the particular smell of each thing. But the voices carried, and she was already still. And what she heard made her go stiller. Senator Harwick Pruitt's voice, and a man she did not recognize, whose speech had the clipped precision of someone trained in legal formality. "The document has been prepared and notarized," the legal voice said. "Transfer of the eastern 400 acres, contingent on the marriage proceeding as scheduled. And if he refuses to sign, then we activate the matrimonial covenant clause." Pruitt's voice was unhurried, the voice of a man who had never been in a situation he could not manage. Any property secured as part of a formal engagement agreement can be contested in territorial court. He can fight it. He will spend 5 years and a considerable portion of his operating income doing so. He won't fight. He is practical. Good. Then he signs before the ceremony or after it, and either way those acres are ours by fall. The sound of a chair shifting. And the woman. What woman? The cook. The large one. Pruitt made a sound that was not quite a laugh. She is here to make the food and disappear. She is of no consequence to anyone. Nora stood in the cellar in the dark with her hand on a ham she had been curing for 3 weeks and did not move for a long time. She waited until the voices had been gone for 5 full minutes. Then she came up and went to the kitchen table and took the small notebook she kept for supply calculations and wrote down every word she had heard, as precisely and completely as she could remember them. The names, the legal term, the numbers, the exact phrasing of the threat. She wrote it in the small, careful handwriting she had developed over years of writing things that needed to be accurate. She tore the page from the notebook and folded it twice and put it in the pocket of her work dress. Then she lit the lamp, went back down to the cellar, and finished checking the hams. On the morning of the 4th of July, Nora did not sleep. She had been in the kitchen since 2 in the morning, moving through the final preparations with the focused stillness of someone who has pushed past exhaustion into that particular country beyond it, where the body simply continues because the mind has given it no other option. The bread was done. The hams were rested and ready to carve. 14 pies stood in careful rows along the cellar shelves. The sauces were made, and the cake stood in the center of the table. 4 tiers of ivory buttercream smooth as pressed linen, climbing roses and sweet peas in pale pink and white, each petal pressed by hand, each one placed with the kind of attention that had no name except the one her grandmother had given it. It was the finest thing Nora Hatch had ever made. She knew it without vanity, the way a craftsman knows when the work is exactly right. Not because it was impressive, though it was. Because it was true. Because every element of it had been built from knowledge she had earned over 38 years of paying attention to what flour does in heat, to how fat renders, to the precise moment when sugar moves from amber to burnt and cannot be recovered. She had made this cake the way she made everything she cared about, which was with the full weight of everything she knew. Opal appeared in the doorway just after 7. "Wagons are arriving, maybe an hour before guests reach the house. I'm ready." "Are you?" Opal looked at her with the particular expression she had been wearing for the past 2 weeks. Not quite pity, not quite worry. Something between the two that Nora found harder to bear than either. "He asked about you this morning, before you were up, asked if you had slept, asked if you needed anything brought in from the supply shed." She paused. "I have been on this property a long time. I know what that man looks like when he is being polite, and I know what he looks like when he means something. This morning was not polite." Nora picked up her carving knife and tested the edge against her thumb. "I need today to be simple. Opal." "All right." Opal turned to go, then stopped. "Whatever happens today, you made something extraordinary in this kitchen. Don't let anyone take that from you." She left before Nora could answer. At noon, Sylvia came to the kitchen. She was in her wedding dress, ivory silk perfectly fitted, her hair arranged with the kind of precision that announces an occasion. She stood in the doorway and looked at the cake, and for one moment, before the arrangement of her face reasserted itself, something honest moved across it. "It is beautiful," she said. "Thank you." Sylvia's eyes moved from the cake to Nora. Whatever had been there closed back over. The service begins at 1. First courses on the tables by 2:30. Everything exactly as discussed. Yes. Sylvia started to turn, then she stopped. She stood with her back to Nora for 2 full seconds. long enough for Nora to understand that something was being considered and decided. And Sylvia turned back. Her voice was quieter than it had been, and it had lost some of its management. "I'm sorry," she said, "about the condition in the letter." That was all. She did not explain it, and she did not expand on it, and she did not wait for a response. She turned and walked out of the kitchen, and Nora heard her footsteps moving down the hall toward the sound of 200 guests arriving for her wedding. Nora stood in the kitchen for a moment with those words in the air around her. Then she turned back to her table and began. The ceremony happened without her. She heard the music from the kitchen, a fiddle and a guitar played by someone who knew what they were doing, and she heard the particular settling sound of 200 people finding their seats, and then the quiet that meant something was beginning. She kept her back to the corridor door and her hands in constant motion, and she did not think about what was happening in the room at the end of the hall, or who was standing at the front of it, or what his face looked like when he made a promise he had not yet decided whether to keep. She had a job to do, and she did it. By the time the celebration moved into the banquet hall, the first course was plated and waiting. Opal and two young ranch hands moved the dishes through the corridor. Course after course, each one right, each one exactly what she had planned and tested and built over 6 weeks of mornings that started before the sun and ended after it. She worked the way she had always worked, completely and without remainder. And for the hour and a half that the meal was being served, the kitchen was her entire world, and it was enough. The feedback came back in fragments. A cattleman from Laramie said the smoked ham was the finest he had eaten in 30 years. A woman from Cheyenne asked 3 times who had made the bread. Senator Pruitt held up his wineglass and said the feast was a credit to the Merritt name, and the room agreed. Nora heard all of it and noted it with the part of her mind that kept score, and the part of her that had pressed every petal of every sugar flower by hand heard it differently, as the particular silence of a name not being said, and understood that this was the arrangement she had agreed to, and she had known what it meant when she agreed to it, and she kept working. It was Opal who brought the cake out, and Nora watched the corridor door close behind them and understood that she had done everything she could do. She untied her apron. She sat down on the stool by the cold stove for the first time in 14 hours, and the edges of the room went slightly soft the way things look when the body has been pushed further than it was meant to go, and she closed her eyes for just a moment. She was almost peaceful. Then she heard Sylvia's voice through the wall, not through the thin corridor wall this time, through the main wall itself, which meant Sylvia was standing close to the kitchen side of the banquet hall and speaking at volume. The celebration had reached the toasting hour. "I want to take a moment," Sylvia said, her voice carrying the bright tone of a woman raised to be heard in rooms like this one, "to address the extraordinary meal you have all enjoyed this afternoon." Murmurs of appreciation, glasses lifted. Many of you have asked who is responsible for this feast. I want to be transparent with you all, because transparency is something I value above almost everything. Nora opened her eyes. "We engaged a local woman to handle the cooking, a widow from outside of town, hard-working in the way that simple women are hard-working. But what you have eaten today was not simply the product of her efforts. Every dish was planned under my direct guidance. Every decision about the menu, about the presentation, about the standard we were reaching for. That direction came from me. She executed. I directed." A small, elegant laugh from somewhere in the hall. "Without that direction, I'm afraid what you would have eaten would have been considerably more rustic." Laughter moved through the room like a wave, easy and unhurried, the laughter of people who have eaten well and are comfortable and have been given permission to find something amusing. "I say this not to diminish her," Sylvia continued, her voice finding its full register, "but to be honest with our guests, when you engage a woman of that particular type, you learn to manage expectations accordingly. She is stout. She is plain. She has never been anywhere, and her ambitions extend no further than her kitchen. Bless her heart." The last 3 words fell into the room like an amen. Nora sat on her stool and did not move. Every dish on every table in that room, every pie on the cellar shelf, every petal of every sugar flower on the 4-tiered cake that was at this moment sitting at the head table where 200 people were raising their glasses in appreciation of someone else's vision. Every 5 o'clock morning and aching back an hour of planning and knowledge passed down from the woman who came west from Kentucky in a covered wagon and never once lost a person in her care. Bless her heart. Her hands were completely still on her knees. She had prepared herself to be invisible. She had prepared herself to go unthanked and uncredited and to walk out the back way while everyone celebrated in the front rooms. She had not prepared herself to be made into the punchline of a story told to entertain people who were eating food she had made. Opal came through this door 12 seconds later, and one look at her face told Nora she had heard every word. She crossed the room in 4 steps and put both hands on Nora's shoulders. "Don't," Nora said. Her voice was very quiet. "Nora, don't say anything." The steadiness of it cost her something she could not have named. "I'm going to clear the kitchen, and then I'm going to go. You cannot just leave." "Opal." She looked at her directly. "I need to leave. That is what I need. I need to walk out of this kitchen and down the road and go home." Opal looked at her for a long moment. Then she stepped aside. Nora untied her apron and laid it on the table. She gathered her knives in their roll of cloth, her grandmother's skillet wrapped back in its straw, moving with the focused efficiency of someone who had learned long ago how to leave places without making a scene, how to take up no more space in her departure than she had been permitted to take up in her arrival. She was at the door when it opened from the outside. Gideon stepped in. He was still in his wedding clothes, the dark coat and white shirt and silver watch chain at his vest. His hat was in his hand. His face was not the face she was accustomed to seeing across the table in the early morning quiet. Something in it had been pushed past its usual composure and had not fully recovered, and the effort of holding it in place was visible in the set of his jaw and the stillness of his hands. He stopped when he saw her with her things gathered. "You are leaving," he said. "I am done here." She kept her voice level, the voice of a hired person completing an engagement. "Congratulations on your marriage, Mr. Merritt. The remaining dishes are plated and ready. Opal knows the order of service. She had no right." His voice was low and absolutely controlled. Nora looked at him directly for the first time since he had walked in, and what she saw in his face was not what she had expected. She had not expected what was actually there, which was something that had been pushed hard enough that it was pushing back, something that had run out of room to be contained. "It is your wedding day. Please go back to your guests," what she said in that room. Nora. She heard him use her name the way he had used it some mornings over coffee when he was saying something true and wanted her to hear it as true. It was an arrangement I agreed to. She tightened her grip on the knife roll. "I need to go." She moved toward the door. He did not block her, but he did not step aside either. He stood in the space and said, "I am not going back in there." She stopped. She did not turn around. "I cannot stand in that room beside that woman and accept congratulations for a marriage that was never what either of us pretended it was." His voice was steady in the way that things are steady when they are working hard against themselves. "I'm sorry. I know that is not your problem. I know you need to go." She turned around. He was looking at her with an expression that had finally let go of everything it had been managing. And what was underneath it was something she recognized because she had been carrying a version of it herself for 6 years. The look of a person who has been pretending that a thing is not what it is for long enough that the pretense has become expensive. "I did not come to this marriage honestly," he said. "I told myself that obligation was the same thing as integrity, that wanting to leave was not a sufficient reason to leave. I believed my father when he said the worst decisions a man makes are the ones made to avoid disappointing other people. And then I spent 8 months making exactly those decisions." He paused. "When I walked back into that hall after the ceremony and heard what she said about you, I understood that I had run out of time." Nora looked at him standing in his wedding clothes in her kitchen, the kitchen she had run for 6 weeks and would not run after today. She thought about the folded piece of paper in the pocket of her work dress. She thought about the voices she had heard through a cellar wall and the words she had written down by lamplight and what she was going to do with them in the morning. "Gideon," she said. It was the first time she had said his name to his face, and she saw him register it. "Whatever is happening in that room, you need to go back and face it. Not for her, for yourself." She held his gaze. "You are not a man who walks away from hard things. I have known that about you since the 3rd morning." He looked at her with that direct, unguarded expression. What if the hard thing is not in that room? The silence that followed was the loudest thing in the kitchen. "Go," she said softly. He went. She heard his footsteps moving back down the corridor toward the hall, and she stood at the door with her knives under her arm and her grandmother's skillet against her chest and the piece of paper in her pocket. And she waited. She did not know precisely what she was waiting for. She knew what she had heard through a cellar wall. She knew what was written on the page in her pocket. She knew that some things, once set in motion, Do not stop until they have finished. She didn't have to wait long. The music stopped. The layered sound of 200 people in celebration changed all at once, flattened, became the sound of a room recalibrating to something it had not anticipated. And then she heard Gideon's voice, raised in that hall for the first time all day, saying Sylvia's name in a tone that came through the wall like something solid. Nora stepped out the door and into the July evening. She walked across the yard and through the gate and down the road that ran along the south fence of the property. And she walked until the sound from the hall was carried on the flat air like something happening at a sufficient distance to belong to someone else's life. She stopped when she reached the bend in the road where the cottonwoods grew along the creek bed, and she stood in the shade of them and put her hand against the bark of the nearest one and breathed. Behind her she could hear the shape of what was happening, even if she could not make out the words. Sylvia's voice rising, Senator Pruitt, controlled at first, then not. 200 people going very quiet in the way that crowds go quiet when the thing they came to watch has become something other than what they expected. She reached into her pocket and took out the folded page and read it once, to confirm she had remembered it correctly. She had. She folded it again and put it back in her pocket and began walking toward town. She had been on the road perhaps 20 minutes when she heard Opal behind her. Opal had not run exactly, but she had moved at the fastest pace that long dignity would permit. And when she reached Nora, she was breathing with the deliberateness of someone choosing not to show how winded she was. He stopped the whole proceeding. Opal said. Nora did not slow her pace. Stood up in front of all of them and said he would not sign the Eastern Acres under any arrangement, and he would not stand beside a woman who had just done what she did in there. She paused for one breath. Then the senator started in about the covenant clause, and Gideon told him in front of 200 people that any man who arranges a marriage as a land acquisition deserves to have the arrangement fail. Nora kept walking. He's in the kitchen, Opal said. Not the hall, not the porch, the kitchen. He walked back there after everything broke open and he has not come out. She paused. I have been on that property a long time. I know when that man is waiting for something and I know when he is waiting for someone. That is not the same thing. Nora stopped walking. She looked at the road ahead of her, and then at the page in her pocket, and then at the Wyoming sky going amber and enormous at the edges as the afternoon moved toward evening. I have 40 acres outside this town, and a banknote and a roof I need to fix, she said, more to herself than to Opal. I'm not a woman men choose. I'm a woman who feeds people and goes home. I've been that woman my whole life. Opal was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Maybe. But you are also the woman who watched a senator try to steal a man's land through a marriage contract and decided to do something about it. She paused. I came to check on you the night of the 3rd. I saw the light under the kitchen door past midnight. I saw your face when you came up from the cellar. I didn't ask because it was not my place to ask. But I know what you were doing at that table afterward, and I know what you put in your pocket. Nora looked at the road. He is in the kitchen, Opal said. Nora stood in the cottonwood shade with the July evening settling around her and thought about Samuel, who had been a good man and had never once asked her why. She thought about what it meant to build something with your hands and then watch someone try to take it, and the specific clarity that comes in the moment you decide you are not going to allow that. She turned around. The kitchen was quiet when she came through the door. Gideon was standing at the far end of the table with both hands braced on the surface and his head down. His coat was off. His sleeves were rolled to the elbow. He looked up when she came in. You came back, he said. Opal is persuasive. Nora set her things on the side counter. She looked at him carefully, at what the last 2 hours had done to his composure. It was still there, but sitting over something that had not finished running. Are you all right, No? He said, without any attempt to soften it. Not particularly. She crossed to the stove and checked the temperature out of habit and then turned back to face him. What happened after I left? He straightened, ran one hand back through his hair. I walked back into that room and stood next to Sylvia and looked at 200 people eating food that you made. And I thought about what she had said about you, and I thought about what my father said, that I had believed for 12 years and had been ignoring for 8 months. He paused, and I thought about the Eastern Acres and what the senator's attorney was discussing in my study the night before last. Nora went very still. You heard them, he said. In the cellar. She reached into her pocket, took out the folded page, and set it on the table between them. He looked at it without touching it. What is that? Everything I heard. Written down that same night, as close to word for word as I could manage. She kept her voice steady. Names, the legal term they used, the exact nature of the threat. She met his eyes. I'm going to the federal land office in town tomorrow morning. I'm going to ask to speak with whoever has jurisdiction over territorial property disputes. And I'm going to give them that page and tell them what I heard. He looked at her for a long time. You do not have to do that, he said. I know I do not have to. She met his eyes. I'm doing it because what I heard was wrong, and I am the only person who is in a position to hear it clearly and write it down. She paused. And because no one gets to call something a gift when what it actually is a theft, the kitchen was very still. Then Sylvia came in. She came in fast, and she came in angry, which was a different version of her than the one Nora had spent 6 weeks learning. The managed performance was gone. Her dress was slightly disordered at the shoulder, and several strands of her carefully arranged hair had come loose across her cheek. And her eyes carried the particular bright fury of a woman who has been humiliated in front of everyone she had ever needed to impress. She looked at Nora. She looked at Gideon. She looked at the page on the table between them. Of course, she said. Of course you are in here. Sylvia. Gideon's voice was quiet. Don't. She walked fully into the room. Don't stand in this kitchen in your wedding shirt and tell me I am wrong about what I am seeing. You are not wrong about what you are seeing, he said. You were never wrong about that. I was. Sylvia stopped. Whatever she had prepared to say on the walk from the hall, Nora could see it in her face, the architecture of an argument built for a different room. She looked at Gideon for a long moment. Then she looked at Nora. And what was in her face then was not fury. It was something underneath both fury and contempt, harder to look at than either. It looked almost like recognition. You knew, she said to Nora. Didn't you? From the beginning. I suspected, Nora said carefully. I did not think it was my place to say so. No. Sylvia made a sound that was not quite a laugh, brief and without warmth, but also, Nora noticed, without cruelty. It had the quality of something that escaped rather than something performed. No, you wouldn't have. She looked at the page on the table, then at Nora's hands. You are too decent for that. She said it without softness, but also without malice, like a fact arrived at against her own preference. She turned back to Gideon. The fury had burned down to something colder and more honest. My father is going to come after the Eastern Acres through every legal channel he can find. You know that. I know it. He will make the next 2 years very difficult, probably. You are not afraid of that. He held her gaze. No. She studied him for a moment with the attention of someone seeing a thing clearly for the first time after a long period of getting it wrong. You were never going to sign those acres, she said slowly. Not even at the end. He did not answer, which was answer enough, and she understood it as one. She nodded once, a small, precise movement like something being closed and set aside. Then she looked at Nora one final time, and what came out of her voice was something that cost her, stripped of every register she used for audiences. What you made today was extraordinary, she said. I knew it while I was eating it, and I knew it while I was standing up there saying what I said. I said things that were not true, and I said them in front of people I wanted to impress. And I knew while I was saying them that they were not true. That is not something I can undo. But I wanted you to know that I knew. She left before Nora could respond. The door swung shut behind her, final and quiet. And then the kitchen was still. Nora stood with Sylvia's words settling in the air around her. She had expected many things from this evening. She had not expected that. She is not entirely what I thought she was. Nora said. No, Gideon said. He looked at his hands. Neither am I. I saw how she spoke to you that first morning, and I told myself it was not my place to intervene in an arrangement she had made. I sat at your table every morning for 6 weeks and watched you work, and I let you walk into that hall today knowing she was capable of what she did. He held her gaze. That is not a small thing. Whatever else I did today, that is not a small thing. No, she agreed. It is not. Outside, the sound from the house had changed. Horses being brought around, wagon wheels beginning to turn, the Crandall people consolidating and withdrawing. Gideon looked at the page on the table. When do you go to the land office tomorrow morning? Early. He looked at her steadily. You understand what you are doing. I understand exactly what I'm doing. She met his eyes. I'm going to give that page to the person whose job it is to do something with it. She paused. Not for you, because it is wrong and I am the only witness, and I am not willing to carry that knowledge home and do nothing with it, and because no one gets to call something a gift when what it actually is a theft. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, I need you to hear something before you leave tonight. She waited. I am not a man who says things he does not mean. He said, what I said to you that night after the ceremony, about what this kitchen was and what those mornings were, I meant every word of it. He paused. I'm still meaning it. Nora looked at him across the table. I am not easy, she said. She said it without apology. I have opinions about most things, including bread, and I do not manage well when people speak to me as though my size is a problem I have inconsiderately failed to correct. I have 40 acres that are mine, and I intend to keep them mine. I am not looking to be saved or managed or made smaller than I am. I know, he said. His voice was certain without being loud. I sat at that table and watched you work every morning for 6 weeks. I know exactly who you are. He paused. That is why I'm standing here. The kitchen was very quiet. Nora looked at this man in his work clothes, with dust on his boots and his hat in his hand, standing at the end of the table that had been hers for 6 weeks, looking at her without managing what he found there, without the particular careful neutrality she had learned to recognize in men who found her inconvenient to look at directly. He was looking at her the way he had looked at her every morning when she told him why vinegar kept gluten from tightening, which was to say completely and with his full attention, as though what she was saying mattered enough to be received correctly. She had not been looked at that way in a long time. She had not been sure, until this moment, that she still knew what it felt like. I'm afraid, she said. She said it plainly, without decoration. Not of you, of being wrong about this, of trusting something that looks like what I think it is and discovering it is something else. She held his gaze. I spent 6 years being very careful, and I am good at being careful, and I am not entirely sure I know how to stop. I know, he said, and he said it without minimizing it, without the reassuring inflection that would have made it smaller than it was. I have been careful for 8 months, and careful for 12 years before that, and it has not made me any less afraid of the right things. He paused. But I have not found a single part of what I said tonight that I want to take back. Nora looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, there is bread in the second warming drawer. It will keep 2 days. His mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but something quieter and more certain than a smile, something that had been there a long time without occasion to show itself. She picked up her knife roll and her grandmother's skillet and walked out the door into the Wyoming evening. She did not look back this time. She walked in the long gold light with her things held against her chest and the piece of paper in her pocket and the full weight of the day settling into her body the way exhaustion settles when you finally allow it in. The cottonwoods along the creek were dark against the sky. The sky was enormous and indifferent and belonging to no one, the way Wyoming sky always was. She walked home. She arrived at the Hatch property just after 9 and set her knives on the kitchen table and her grandmother's skillet on its hook on the wall and sat down in the chair she had sat in every morning for 6 years. She put the folded page on the table in front of her and looked at it in the lamplight. Then she took out her notebook and turned to a clean page and wrote, in her careful handwriting, a list of everything she needed to do in the morning. The land office opened at 8. She would be there at 8. She would ask to speak with the federal land commissioner. She would present the page and tell what she had heard and answer every question as precisely and completely as she could. Because precision was the thing she had always been best at. Precision and patience and the willingness to do a thing correctly even when no one was watching. She finished the list. She put the folded page in the front pocket of her good dress, the one she would wear in the morning. Then she went to bed. The federal land office in Harlow Creek occupied the front room of a building on the main street that smelled of old paper and wood polish, and the particular dusty authority of places where official decisions are made. The commissioner was a man named Aldridge, compact and methodical, with the manner of someone who had spent 20 years listening to people tell him things and had learned to distinguish between the ones telling the truth and the ones telling him what they hoped was the truth. He listened to Nora without interrupting. She spoke for 11 minutes. She placed the folded page on his desk and explained when and where she had written it, and why and how. She told him the name she had heard and the legal term that had been used, and the specific nature of the arrangement as it had been discussed between Senator Harwick Pruitt and his attorney in the north corridor of the Merritt property on the evening of July the 3rd. When she finished, he looked at the page for a long time, then looked at her. "You understand," he said, "that testifying to what you heard carries some risk to yourself. The senator has resources and he has patience." "Yes," she said, "and you are prepared to stand by this account if it is required in court." "I wrote it down the same night I heard it," she said, "in my own hand, guesses by lamplight. Before I went back to finish the hams, I can account for every word." He looked at her for another moment with that measuring expression. Then he picked up the page and set it carefully to one side of his desk, in the way that indicated it was no longer hers to take back. She walked out of the land office at 8:47 in the morning and stood on the main street in her good dress, with the July sun warm on her face, and understood that she had done the only thing available to her to do, and that what happened next was no longer in her hands. That was a feeling she recognized. She had been putting things out of her hands for 6 years and learning, slowly and at some cost, which things were hers to carry and which were not. The 40 acres were hers to carry. The banknote was hers to carry. The leaking roof was hers to carry. She stopped at the hardware on the way home and spent an hour selecting the right gauge of tin for the pitch of the roof. Then she went home and changed out of her good dress and climbed up with a hammer and a box of nails and the sheet of new tin, because the roof had been waiting since February and she was not willing to wait any longer. She worked until noon. She came down with scraped hands and an aching back and stood in the yard and looked up at the new tin catching the afternoon light and felt something that was not quite pride but was close enough to it to count. She had fixed her own roof. She had walked into a federal office and given testimony about a sitting United States senator. She had made the finest wedding feast anyone in Harlow Creek County had eaten in a generation. She had done all of that in the span of a single morning, and no one had been there to see any of it. And that was all right. What she had not stopped needing. She understood standing in her yard in the July heat was not the same thing as being seen. It was something she did not have precise language for yet. Something closer to what happened in a kitchen at 5 in the morning when a person asked a real question and actually waited for the answer. She put the hammer away and went inside. The days that followed were quiet in the way days are quiet after something significant has happened and the world has not yet finished deciding what it means. She worked the land. She watered the garden and mended the south fence and cleaned the kitchen from floor to ceiling the way her grandmother had taught her, methodically and completely. She did not go into town except to buy supplies. She did not let herself think about a page sitting on a desk in the land office or what would come of it. She thought about it constantly, and she was very disciplined about not thinking about it. On the 8th day, a letter arrived from the office of the Wyoming Territorial Commissioner. The language was formal and brief. An investigation had been opened into the conduct of Senator Harwick Pruitt regarding improper inducement in a property transfer agreement. Her testimony, along with additional documentation obtained from the Merritt property records, had been sufficient to establish probable cause. She was thanked for her cooperation and informed she might be contacted for further testimony. She read it twice. She folded it and put it in the tin box under her bed, beside Samuel's death certificate and the deed to the land. Then she made a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table and drank it in the quiet. On the 11th day, a letter arrived from Copper Ridge. The handwriting was direct and unadorned, the same hand she had recognized from the top line of the original letter in April. It said, "I searched the kitchen entirely. I could not find what you left behind. If you know what it is, I would be glad to hear it. G.M." Nora sat with that letter for a long time. She thought about what she had said to him the night of the 4th, that she had left something in his kitchen. She had said it not quite knowing what she meant and knowing exactly what she meant at the same time, the way certain true things present themselves before you have language for them. She thought about 6 weeks of 5 o'clock mornings and questions asked by a man who actually waited for the answers. She thought about what her grandmother had said about food made with intention, that you could taste the difference between something made in a hurry and something made with care. And she understood, standing in her own kitchen, that the same principle applied to everything else in a life worth building. She was still afraid. That had not changed. But she had walked into a federal office and given testimony about a United States senator because it was right, and she had climbed up on her own roof with her own hands and fixed the thing herself. And she was beginning to understand that fear was not the same thing as inability, and that the difference between the two was the only thing that had ever actually mattered. She picked up her pen. She wrote Thursday, 5 in the morning. I'm making breakfast. If you want to eat, come. N.H. She sent it the same afternoon. Thursday came gray and cool, the first real suggestion that the summer was beginning to think about releasing its grip on the Wyoming plains. Nora arrived at the Copper Ridge kitchen at 5 exactly, not because she had planned it precisely, but because 5 in the morning was the hour her feet knew, the hour that kitchen had been hers. The back door was unlocked. She let herself in. The kitchen was the same as she had left it, the same stoves, the same hooks on the wall, the same smell of good earth rising through the floorboards. On the table in the center, a coffee cup sat right side up beside the pot on the stove, still warm, and beside the cup, a folded piece of paper. She crossed to the table and picked it up. It said, "In the same direct handwriting I looked everywhere. I cannot find it. Maybe you can tell me what I am looking for. G. M." She was still holding it when the back door opened and Gideon came in with dust on his boots and his hat in his hand, and the expression of a man who had prepared something to say and had decided at the last moment to abandon the preparation entirely. He stopped when he saw her. "Morning," he said. "Morning." They looked at each other across the table. The same table, the same kitchen, the same 5 o'clock light coming through the same window. The light that had started all of this 7 weeks ago when a man she did not know had poured himself a cup of coffee and asked her a real question. "I got your letter," he said. "I got yours." He looked at the note in her hand. "I meant it. I went through the whole kitchen." "I know you did." She set it down on the table. "It is not something you find by looking." He moved to his end of the table, the far end where he had sat every morning for 6 weeks, and he did not pour coffee and he did not sit down. He stood with both hands on the edge and looked at her the way he had looked at her 100 times across this table, except that now there was nothing else in the room, and nothing between them, and the looking was just what it was. "I owe you something," he said. "You don't owe me anything." "I do. You walked into a federal office and gave testimony about a sitting senator because you heard something wrong being planned and you wrote it down and you decided to act on it. You did that without being asked and without telling me and without asking for anything in return." He paused. "The Eastern Acres are mine. The senator's legal challenge was dropped 2 days ago. The territorial commissioner sent a formal notice." She nodded. She had expected something like this. She had not expected to feel the specific quality of relief that moved through her when she heard it, the particular relief of a thing being right that had been wrong. "I also owe you," he said, "for 6 weeks of the finest cooking anyone on this property has ever eaten." He paused. "And for something else, something I have been trying to find the right words for since the night of the 4th. She waited. "I am not a man who says things he does not mean." He said, "What I said to you that night, about what this kitchen was and what those mornings were, I meant every word of it." He looked at her steadily. "I am still meaning it." Nora looked at him across the table. "I am not easy," she said. She said it without apology and without performance. "I have opinions about most things, including bread. I do not manage well when people speak to me as though my size is a problem I have failed to correct. I have 40 acres that are mine, and I intend to keep them mine. I'm not looking to be saved or managed or made smaller than I am." "I know," he said. His voice was steady and certain, the same voice he used when he stated things he was simply certain of. "I sat at that table and watched you work and listened to you talk every morning for 6 weeks. I know exactly who you are." He paused. "That is why I'm standing here." The kitchen was very quiet. Nora looked at this man with dust on his boots and his hat in his hand, standing at the far end of the table that had been hers for 6 weeks, looking at her without managing what he found there, without adjusting his expression to accommodate it. He was looking at her the way he had looked at her every morning she told him why vinegar kept gluten from tightening, which was to say completely, with his full attention, as though what she was saying mattered enough to be received correctly. She had not been looked at that way in a long time. She had not been certain, until this moment, that she still knew what it felt like. "I'm afraid," she said. She said it plainly. "Not of you. Of being wrong about this. Of trusting something that looks like what I think it is and finding out it is something else." She held his gaze. "I spent 6 years being very careful, and I'm good at being careful, and I'm not entirely sure I know how to stop." He said, "I know," and he said it without minimizing it or making it smaller than it was. I have been careful for 8 months and careful for 12 years before that. It has not made me any less afraid of the right things." He paused. "But I have not found a single part of what I said to you that night that I want to take back." Nora looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "The coffee is still warm." He understood immediately. "Yes," he said. "Sit down," she said. "I will tell you what I am thinking about for the Laramie dinner." He sat at his end of the table. She poured the coffee and brought both cups over and sat not across from him, but at the same end of the table, closer than they had ever sat in 6 weeks of mornings. And she began to tell him about the menu she had been building in her mind for 60 cattlemen in September. And he listened with his hands around his cup and his full attention on her face. And the kitchen was warm, and the gray morning came on slowly through the window. And neither of them said anything for a while about what had just happened between them. Because some things, when they finally become real, do not need to be said out loud to be understood. 3 weeks later, he asked her properly, not in the kitchen, on the porch of the Hatch property at the end of an evening when he had come to help rehang the gate on the south fence and had stayed for supper and then stayed well beyond supper. The way people stay when leaving has stopped making sense. He asked plainly and without ceremony, because he was a plain man without ceremony, and she would not have trusted any other version of the asking. She said yes the same way, directly and without performance. Looking at him in the fading September light with the Wyoming sky going large and gold behind him. They were married in October, not at Copper Ridge, on the Hatch property, in the yard of the 40 acres, on a Saturday morning when the light came slant and cool across the plains and the cottonwoods along the creek had gone the color of old coins. The minister came from town. Opal Drummond was there, and she cried without attempting to conceal it. And 3 neighbors came, and one of them brought a fiddle and played 2 songs badly and 1 song very well. There were no 200 guests. There were no spun sugar columns or ivory silk or men from Cheyenne with documents folded in their coat pockets. There was a yard and a morning and 2 people who had decided, each in their own way and at some cost, to stop being afraid of the right things. Nora wore her Sunday dress, the blue one, the best thing in her wardrobe that was not saved for her funeral. And underneath it, tied at her waist where no one could see it, her grandmother's cotton apron. The one that had come west from Kentucky on a covered wagon and had hung on every kitchen wall she had ever worked at, and was now on the wall of her own kitchen in the house she had kept through 6 years of solitude and 1 leaking roof and 1 banknote and 1 tin bucket she had emptied every day since February until the day she climbed up and fixed the thing herself. Not because she was still the woman who worked in other people's kitchens. Not because cooking was all she was. Because that apron was where she had come from. And she had learned over the course of 1 summer in Wyoming that had remade itself 3 times before it was finished that the place you come from is not a thing to be hidden. It is the thing you carry with you into whatever comes next, and it does not diminish you to carry it. It is the evidence of everything you survived in order to be standing where you are standing. Gideon took her hand at the front of the yard in the October light and looked at her the way he had looked at her since the 3rd morning in the Copper Ridge kitchen, without adjustment, without management. Without the particular careful neutrality of men who found her inconvenient. He looked at her as though she was exactly what she was, and that was precisely what he had come for. The minister spoke. Nora said her vows in a clear, steady voice that carried out over the 40 acres and past the south fence with its new gate hanging straight on its new hinges and into the enormous Wyoming distance. When it was finished, Gideon held both her hands in his and said, very quietly, so that only she could hear it, "She would have liked you very much." He meant his mother. Nora knew that, and she knew that the man who had sat at the far end of her work table every morning for 6 weeks, asking real questions and listening to real answers and saying things he meant when he said them, was not offering her a comfortable life or a rescued life or a life in which she would be required to make herself any smaller than she was. He was offering her exactly what he had been offering since the 3rd morning, which was the full attention of a person who had looked at what she actually was and decided that it was worth looking at. She looked at the 40 acres around her, the new tin on the roof catching the October light, the south fence running straight to the tree line, the sky going enormous overhead, wide and indifferent in hers. Nora Hatch, who had spent 6 years being invisible and 6 weeks being hidden, and 1 afternoon being made into a joke in front of everyone, stood in the warm October light of her own yard on her own land and understood that she was, at last, and without qualification, completely seen.